Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Affliction and Divergence. This is episode 15 and 16 of season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my latest user poll for Star Trek Enterprise is the two-parter Affliction and Divergence. So in this two-parter, Phlox is captured by Klingons who try to use him to cure a virus that was created by the Klingons experimenting with augment DNA that had the side effect of creating this virus that was killing people and also smooth the Klingons' ridges to make them look more like humans. And meanwhile, Reed is betraying Archer by working with Section 31, but eventually Archer discovers Phlox and they work together to find a cure for the virus. Alright. I feel like I should just address the elephant in the room right away. Not postpone this, just get to the point immediately. This episode was basically created, and this is what the writers of this episode said, that the concept of this episode was basically created to come up with an in-universe reason for the makeup change for the Klingons that occurred between the original series and the animated series, if you want to count that. That occurred between that and Star Trek the Motion Picture, where in the films they were giving the ridges, and this carried on to Next Generation, all future iterations of Star Trek. Now, in the episode Deep Space Nine, episode Trials and Tribulations, when Worf, of course a Klingon, has the ridges, that he traveled back in time to the original series era where they used footage of the original series episode Trouble with Triples, in which Klingons appear and they do not look at all like modern Klingons. They just had like tan makeup and flat foreheads, and so they had to acknowledge that the Klingons look different. So they did this through Worf simply having a line saying, "We do not discuss this with outsiders," which fit the comedic tone of the episode, and I actually thought worked for the episode. Now, Manny Koto apparently outlines that many fans were up in arms, were like divided on Enterprise, of whether some believe that the Klingons should have appeared on Enterprise with flat ridges or flat foreheads and no ridges in order to remain consistent with the original series. And so his attempt in this episode was to come up with a reason on why Klingons would have flat foreheads in the original series era and ridges in the later era. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, I've mentioned many times before how I feel about this. I hate it. I think this is a stupid idea. I think, and apparently many fans don't feel the same way I do, but I feel it's a makeup change. I mean, I would put why Klingons have flat foreheads in the original series. I'd put that in the same category as why the fuck Pike's yeoman is using pen and paper and a notepad, or why in the episode The Naked Time they have like an analog timer with like wheels in it that's counting down the time, which of course is ancient technology now, let alone the 23rd century. I'd put these all in the same or why the Gorn just looked like someone wearing a college mascot uniform. I put it all down to the same thing. It's because the original series, was made in the 60s. And this is all what they had to deal with the budget. They didn't have the budget or the technology to do the flat, rigid foreheads which eventually they did in 1979 when the motion picture came out. But even those, if you look at the motion picture ones, they look they don't look as good. I would argue it wasn't until Search for Spock, Star Trek 3, that they perfected the Klingon makeup, and it more resembles what would be known as the Klingon look going forward. But I'm not even going to discuss Discovery here. That's a whole other ball of wax. But anyway, so it's a makeup change. And it's you can file it in the same thing with all these other production issues of why the Enterprise in the original series looks so cheap and why the special effects, because it was made in the 60s, and obviously they didn't have the ability. They apparently always wanted to have the Klingons look more different, and they hadn't really decided on how the Klingons would behave or act in this era, because. And I just covered the second season of the original series, and the Klingons do not act like Klingons. They act more like Ferengi, for the most part. Is because they hadn't really established them as a recurring race. This would become later. So I would look back at any earlier material as like, if you watch the first season of the original series, they keep saying Klingons or Klingons, like they can't even agree how to pronounce it. And also, for that matter, for most of season 1 of the original series, they say Vulcanian instead of Vulcan. Now, that's just a production issue. It's just because it wasn't a long-term established franchise, and it was just a random sci-fi show, low-budget sci-fi show on television, and they didn't really, they weren't intending that. They didn't know this would be like a long-lasting franchise that would go for 60 plus years and create an entire universe. They were just writing television episodes. So and again, and I also talked about how the balance of terror with the Romulan war is totally inconsistent. I wonder how Enterprise would have treated that. Now I'm thinking of it. So this is all to say that they shouldn't come up with an in-universe excuse for what is simply a production issue, and to do so pisses me off. Speaking of Discovery, they did try to do crap like this to try to explain away the inconsistencies between Discovery, which is using modern technology and is trying to depict an actual 200 years in the future, so having it look like the cheesy 1960s sets wouldn't make any sense. And so they had to try to explain away, why we're using holograms when they didn't use holograms in the original series. To have a line where Pike says, let's rip the hologram things, the hologram emitters from the Enterprise. Like, no, that does not explain it away. And also, the stupid Klingon makeup change that they did in Discovery, which made them look worse, like demons. They try to explain that away. It's like, they were just bald because they all shaved their heads because they shaved their heads in war, which is something that's never been established in Star Trek ever. Again, it's just a BS excuse to try to come up with an in-universe reason for a makeup change, and I really, really wish they would not. I think that's treating, again, obviously some fans disagree with me, but I feel like that's treating the fan base as morons. Like, they can't take in the external knowledge of it's just a production change. It was made in the 60s with cheap, with low budgets, lesser technology. They couldn't do what they could do now. Now they could, so now they're doing it. You just have to hand wave it away, which is why I think Worf's line in Trials and Tribulations is so perfect, because it's the way to just acknowledge it, but hand wave it away because we do not discuss it with outsiders. Like, that is the perfect response to it, because there is no real reason, and there should never be an in-universe reason. Now, let me address the in-universe reason that came up in this episode, and how, in fact, it does not work. It doesn't. See, this is why it bothers me so much. Not only should they not try to come up with an in-universe reason for what is obviously a makeup change. Secondly, it doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't actually fit. And in fact, I don't think any would make sense or fit, which is why you shouldn't even fucking do it. So, the in-universe excuse that they come up in this episode is that because the Klingons were messing around with human augment DNAs in an attempt to try to create Klingon augments, they ended up having the side effect of making them look more humans, and they even addressed this. So they fixed the disease, but the fact that these Klingons now look at like humans is something that could never be fixed. So it's going to be permanent. It's going to affect their children for several generations. Just as much to get through the original series. So it's trying to come up with this BS excuse. And I can give you 3 reasons off the top of my head why it doesn't work. Kor, Kang, and Koloth. Because all 3 of these characters appeared in the original series looking like humans with flat foreheads, and then all 3 appeared in Deep Space Nine with the modern ridges makeup. So how come did they just spurt the ridges later in life? Now, one could make the argument, because they did discuss constructive surgery, that they had simply opted to have the surgery later, sometime between the original series and Deep Space Nine, to look more like Klingons, and behave totally different as well, to match more of what the behavior of modern Klingons. Well, that was mainly just Koloth. Kang and Kor pretty much were kind of portrayed as Klingons were, and they were more consistent, but Koloth was, again, portrayed as a Ferengi, and he was a completely different character in Deep Space Nine, but that's aside. So, yeah, you can make that silly argument, but then I would argue back, how come all of the Klingons in the original series look like humans, and it's not just some, as this episode would imply, and how come none of them opted for this surgery, constructive cosmetic surgery? How come these captains who are glorified Klingon captains and well respected and honored in the Empire, why would they wait till late in their career to get these surgeries? I'll tell you why. Because it's a bunch of nonsense. It is a bunch of nonsense. Why none of the Klingons look like Klingons during the original series? So all of them were affected by this augmented DNA, and then by the time we get to the original series movies, let alone Next Generation, all of a sudden none of them are affected by the augmented DNA, or they all decide to get the surgery at the same time. It is so much bullshit. It actively angers me, like, immensely. And the fact that they would build 2 episodes on trying to do this, I can't even begin to express how much it pisses me off. As I say, it's treating the audience like idiots, like they don't know what a fucking production makeup. Like, you have that knowledge because you know you're watching a TV show. You know that Star Trek is actually just a TV show, right? Like, we don't need in-universe excuses for clear production changes. And one thing I think is hilarious is that Manny Koto, who I really respect and really I think he did save Enterprise. And in fact, I'm going to keep quoting this all the time. Brennan Braga said that Manny Koto should have been in charge of Enterprise from the beginning, which I could not agree with more. But he said, apparently in a quote, that this was his favorite episode. He thought this was the best episode. This 2-parter was the best episode of season 4. Which I'm just shocked, because season 4 had some amazing episodes, nonetheless, being the Vulcan trilogy of the Kirshar trilogy, and how he could think this is anywhere near better than that is beyond me. Yeah. so I think this is one of the worst things the Star Trek franchise ever done, and frankly, I do not consider this canon because it doesn't make any sense. It's one of those things such as that, that Tribble short trek where they fucked up the history of the Tribbles, where I just completely dismiss it as canon, as well as some of the original series stuff, which has said that like they weren't thinking of world building, and it doesn't match into the rest of canon. And that's fine. I dismiss it. In my mind, these things are not canon, and I definitely consider this episode or this stupid, lame attempt to try to make a in the universe excuse to describe a makeup change. It doesn't exist. I do not consider this canon. I don't care what anyone says. Now, getting into the two-parter itself, regardless of any of this, but I did feel like I needed to tackle that right off the bat. There was no point in me trying to delay it or push it towards the end of the review. I needed to tackle that right away. But, this two-parter's not bad. Like, if I overlook that as the whole, which was the whole concept, the whole premise of it, if I overlook that, which that actively angers me, but I wouldn't say this two-parter sucks. It's actually it's fairly decent. I am reminded whenever watching episodes from the fourth season of how much Manny Coda was better at running the show and story writing. And one of the things, because one of the inherent built-in issues with Enterprise is, and this is something I talked about a lot, is the flat, boring, cliche bunch of characters that Braga and Berman sucked at creating unique characters or interesting characters. And that's another thing Coda was trying to course correct in season 3 and 4. And I think season 3, and I talk about season 3, did a great job of actually trying to flesh out. It did an amazing job with Tripp and Reed and a few other characters. But I noticed in season 4 they try to focus more on some of the minor characters who were nothing but, background ice or flat characters with no personality, which tend to be the minority characters, which you can imply anything from that or not, I don't know. But anyway, I kind of do, to be honest, because of Braga's tendency to glorify the 1950s, but whatever. Anyway, so particularly Hoshi and Mayweather, and they try to actually, and Reed too, they actually try to develop them in season 4 and make them a bit more interesting. In this episode, you have Hoshi having that hanging out with Phlox and developing, getting more into her background, how she likes to go to this restaurant and she knows a lot of people in communications and tons of Starfleet officers are there, and how when Phlox is attacked that she tries to fight back, and then she can't remember exactly what was said. She has to have a mind meld with T'Pol, which I love. This is after mind melds has kind of been destigmatized, but it's just after, so there's still that echo of the stigmatism attached to it yet. So T'Pol was very hesitant to do it. But she does do it, and that was a nice sort of inclusion. I feel like they never really got to fully develop these minor characters, sadly, but they were doing a much better job than the first 2 seasons did, and I have no doubt had the show. In fact, I would be as bold to say they did a better job at developing characters like Hoshi and Mayweather in season 3 and 4 than Discovery did of all these bridge officers. And in 4 seasons, they just randomly spat out stuff from their childhood, and they're not really developed. But that's another story. Anyway. So Mayweather is actually tackled more in another 2-parter towards the end of the season, Demons and Terra Prime. But here they try to develop Reed more, And I don't know if it kind of works for me. I mean, it kind of does. Where they invent a past where he was apparently worked for Section 31 in the past, which to me kind of borders the whole like Dr. Bashir being genetically engineered, something that they just retconned in season 5. Now, don't get me wrong, this is nowhere near as bad as that, nowhere near, but it does have that same veneer of feeling like coming out of nowhere, and it's obvious that they never planned for this before, and it's just something that they instantly materialize, and that aspect of it does kind of bother me a bit, but I buy it a lot more than I buy the genetically enhanced thing, which I really don't buy. And so, and it makes for an interesting, addition to the episode. It does makes Reed's character more interesting, to be fair. It has that element of, Reed butting heads with Archer, and Archer feel like he betrayed him. And I do like that aspect of it. I think that works. But I'll tell you what one of my favorite aspects of this two-parter is the fact that it portrays Section 31 as fuck-ups. Because I think Section 31 is a very interesting concept in Star Trek, but I don't personally agree with them. Like, I see them as villains, really. And when Bashir would have his arguments with Sloan in Deep Space Nine, I would always side with Bashir. Now, sometimes in the moment, Section 31 may appear to be in the right, but the whole concept of them, that basically something that Discovery would retcon, but again, I'm not talking about Discovery, but the whole concept of them working outside of the law, like, there's reasons why laws exist. There's reasons why there's due process. There's reasons why things are decided by, elected officials that, supposedly, in Star Trek times, I would assume they actually do, unlike modern times, work for the people and just represent the people. There's reasons why we have all that kind of process, and there's reasons why you would not want to work outside of that process for the good of the Federation. And I do like that, because that's something Sloan would often bring up in Deep Space Nine and be like, oh, this is for the greater good, or I'm doing what's best for the Federation. But what gives you the fucking right, the fucking power to decide that unilaterally? Like, as I said, there's reasons why we have this kind of development, so I think this is I love the way it's exemplified in this two-parter, that it's explained that this Section 31 dude was like, well, I'm doing what's right for the Federation. Enterprise. Whatever. I'm doing what's right for Earth. I'm doing what's best for Starfleet. And this is what is necessary and needs to be done. And it turned out he got played and he fucked up. And so he made things worse by not doing things through the proper channel. By trying to arrogantly assume that he knew what was best for humanity more than actual trained Starfleet or elected officials. And it backfired on him. And I love that. I think that is a very appropriate portrayal of Section 31. That they're not a good thing. They are villains. And they are, you could argue like they do help humanity occasionally, but that doesn't justify their existence. I totally agree with Bashir. The ends do not justify the means. So anyway, but I love how even the ends were wrong here, because he made an alliance with that Klingon guy to try to find a cure for the Klingons, to better relations between Klingon Empire and Starfleet, and the Klingon guy ended up like betraying him, and once he didn't need him anymore, it was like, yo, but I don't need you anymore. and just slapped, and just completely screwed him, and decided to destroy Enterprise in Columbia, and Enterprise in Columbia almost got destroyed because of this stupid Section 31 fuck up. And I do like the conclusion where Reed, realizes his mistake and realizes that was wrong to work outside of the actual chain of command, and when contacts that Section 31 guy contacts him, he's like, never contact him again, I only answer to one commanding officer, Captain Archer. That was a great moment. I was like, fuck yeah, Reed. I love that. So yeah, I did enjoy that aspect to it. Now, let's talk about Columbia, because this is another aspect of the episode I've really enjoyed. I really liked Captain Hernandez, I believe her name is. I talked about her in the episode Home, where she was mainly hanging out with Archer, and they had, of course, a past relationship and whatever. And I talked then about how I liked her character, but here we get to see her more in the professional context as the captain of Columbia, and I'm sorry, she's a more interesting character than Captain Archer. She only appeared in like 3 episodes, and yet those 3 episodes she seemed more interesting and fleshed out than Archer did over 4 seasons. I would rather watch a show about her than Archer, if I'm being completely honest. But I loved her inclusion there. I actually loved her interactions with Archer and sort of camaraderie that they had, and how they had to work together to solve this issue. And this is the first episode of Enterprise where we actually see Enterprise having to team up with another Starfleet ship, of course, because before this season there were no other Starfleet ships, or at least not any vessels like Enterprise. They were all just like cargo ships or whatever, or dinky scientific vessels. So and it was great to see him team up and take on the Klingons. And I love the scenes with her and them trying to sort of, work together. Now, I guess I should mention this is the episode Seth MacFarlane appeared in. Now, I never watched Family Guy, and I still didn't really care about that show, and I never really seen any of his movies, although I think this episode was made before his movies, so I think he was mainly known just for Family Guy at the moment. But of course he was a long-time Star Trek fan, as we know, because he made a whole show that was ripping off Star Trek, where he could ego play being the captain of his own Starfleet ship. So egotistical. Anyway, he appeared in this episode as, or the first episode, Affliction, as an engineer working for Tripp. And of course, yeah, when I first saw this, I didn't know who he was. I had no idea. I didn't recognize that. I just learned years after the fact from like reading articles like, oh, the creator of Family Guy was in Enterprise because he's a huge Star Trek fan. I was like, oh, okay, that's who that guy is. Oh, I didn't even know what he looked like back then. But anyway, so that was kind of cool. Of course, I recognize him from that plagiarizing show that he did now, where he plays out his fantasy of being a Star Trek captain. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a guy from the ripoff show. Anyway. So it's kind of interesting to see him there. Anyway, so the Tripp story aspect of being on Columbia is kind of, I think that's a bit wishy-washy. I don't feel as positively about that storyline, because it seemed a bit ridiculous. Because, all right, he quits Discovery. He quits Enterprise to join Columbia, mainly to get away from T'Pol, which is, as I talked about in the episode where that happened, I understand that's like, I can totally relate to having sort of feelings for someone, but knowing that a actual relationship would never work and will work, so the best solution is to just get away from them, and that's something I can completely agree with. And I do like that sort of aspect that Tripp is just having to distance himself from T'Pol. But the thing I don't like about this episode, and I found a bit wishy-washy, is that Tripp left to go to Columbia, and then most of the second part is about getting Tripp back on Enterprise, because he never should have left, because the chief engineer that replaced him apparently is a complete utter moron and is useless, which I don't like. Tripp can't be the only smart engineer in Starfleet. Now, I understand he's the most experienced. I mean, I think he's a moron, but anyway, I think he's the most. He has no common sense. This is why I don't like this character. But anyway, he is the most experienced engineer, because he was the only engineer to, run the actual Warp 5 ship for several years. So I understand that, but it just seems really wishy-washy that he left Enterprise and then we had to have a 15-minute sequence of him coming back to Enterprise. Kind of like a waste. Maybe the writers should have never have him leave in the beginning. It's like they have him leave just so they could do this whole sequence, and then they come up with some contrived excuses to keep him on Enterprise a bit longer so he can be in the next episodes. See, I like the concept of Tripp leaving to go on to Columbia. I don't like the concept of him returning. I think if they were going to do this storyline, they should have committed to it. They should have had him leave permanently, or at least for several seasons, although we do know that this gets canceled after this season, so there are no more seasons. But they didn't know that at this time, I believe. It wasn't learned until In the Mirror Darkly, I believe, when they learned that they were getting canceled. So, as far as they knew, they were setting up for a season 5, so I wish they would have just kept Tripp separate. And having this whole sequence to have him, we need him back because all our other engineers suck. That kind of bothers me, to be honest. Like, it was a cool scene when they had the two ships, traveling at warp, because Enterprise was stuck at warp, but they had to transfer Tripp, and they had to, go upside down and ride each other in the warp bubble. That was a cool scene. I just don't like the premise behind it, that they're all doing this to get Tripp back, who probably shouldn't have left to begin with, but whatever. And as for the whole Klingon stuff of them trying to create augments and kidnapping Phlox, it's okay. I don't know. I've gotten a bit tired of Klingons at this point, and having the Colonel be such a asshole, whatever, and keep talking about killing Phlox. I did like how Phlox was eventually like, go ahead and kill me. I'm not doing what you say. And then they tortured him, and he still refused to do it. I liked that. That was powerful stuff, and that the Klingon doctor or the scientist agreed to deceive, work with Phlox to deceive the other Klingon guy, which he knew would get them both killed. But they was look, what's a greater honorable death for a healer to die by saving millions of lives? That was powerful. I did like that, but overall, I don't know. I just became less interested in Klingon, especially when they had the dude's son who was captured by Archer on the Enterprise. I didn't really care that. He was like, oh, no wonder you humans are weak. You eat dead food. Yeah, I've heard this all a billion times before. I'm not really interested anymore. I'm sorry. But, and also that general guy who was coming to, wipe out the planet, and he was became the enemy of part 2, because he wouldn't listen to reason, and he was extremely cliche. He was just I don't know, mustache twirly, unreasonable villain who, I don't know, was there for plot convenience. So I wasn't a huge fan of that either. So anyway, my rating for Affliction and Divergence out of 10 is a 7, very good. Now, it's a tenuous 7. I was really close to giving this a 6 because of that makeup thing just pisses me off so much. But really, even though that was the the concept behind the episode, really that's something that only comes into play at the very end of the episode. Most of the episode, as I said, I really enjoyed character development of characters like Hoshi and Reed. I love what they did with Section 31, by betraying them, as saying that, basically showing how they shouldn't exist, and they can fuck up just as much and just make things worse, and they shouldn't have an organization that operates outside the law. Plain and simple. And I love how this episode reinforces that. And what else? Yeah, and the Klingon storyline was interesting. Like Phlox's his interactions with the other Klingon could be interesting from time to time. And I love Columbia, and I love seeing Captain Hernandez, and I love their teaming up with Enterprise to solve this crisis. But that being said, there was, I had this stuff with the wishy-washy stuff with Tripp leaving and then coming back and keeping excuses, making excuses for him to be there, and how none of the engineers could do it. And plus the Klingonness of the whole episode, I'm kind of sick of and tired of, and I didn't think it added anything new. So I didn't think the premise of this episode was that interesting to begin with. And yes, once again, coming up with an in-universe excuse to explain the makeup changes. Terrible! So this episode definitely cannot get more than a 7. I feel like I'm actually being generous by giving this episode a 7. But, as I said, there was a lot of stuff about it I did like. So that's it for my review of Affliction and Divergence. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more Star Trek episodes, as well as other shows such as Star Trek Picard and The Expanse, Star Wars The Clone Wars, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.